How did a caveman surgeon open a living patient's skull with a blade chipped from stone? What could anyone do about the pain before modern anesthesia? And when archaeologists count the skulls that healed, how many people seem to have survived? In tonight's boring History for Sleep, we'll try to answer all three and follow the clues left by one of prehistory's strangest medical feats. I'm Elias. If you enjoy strange history told softly, subscribe for another journey tomorrow night. For now, get comfortable and let the questions do the work. You don't need to remember every place or date, and if you drift off halfway through, the old skulls will still be waiting whenever you return. Our first scene begins under the quiet lights of a modern laboratory in southeastern Spain. On the table is the skull of an adult woman who lived more than 4,000 years ago. There is no dramatic operating room to reconstruct, no famous surgeon's name, and no convenient note explaining what happened. There are only two openings in the bone, close enough to turn one strange event into a much stranger question. You lean a little closer. The first surprise isn't simply that part of the skull is missing. It's the edge around the opening. Instead of looking fresh and sharply broken, parts of the margin have been changed by the woman's own body. The surface has begun to reorganize itself, softening the boundary left by the original act. The whole attracts attention, but archaeologists often learn more from the rim, where a damaged object becomes the record of a living person. The changed bone means healing began after the opening was made. In plain English, she lived through it for at least some period of time. The edge can't tell us whether that period was comfortable, whether she returned to ordinary work, or whether she felt anything like recovery. It is not a clock, and archaeology rather inconveniently does not print receipts. But the bone did respond, and that response is the first solid clue in our story. The woman came from Camino del Molino, a large collective burial site used during the Copper Age. Well over 1,000 people were deposited there across two funerary phases. Skeletal analysis and ancient DNA identified this individual as an adult woman, and microscopy brought investigators closer to the openings. That gives us a real person, a real place, and a real pair of openings. It does not give us her name. It does not tell us who held the tool. And it certainly does not tell us what she said when somebody arrived with what may have been the prehistoric version of a very bad idea. Yet somebody did make an opening, and her body did begin to repair the edge. More remarkably, the same skull records more than one intervention. We have to be careful here. Two openings do not prove the same operator, the same motive, or two identical procedures. They do show why this case is so hard to dismiss as a single accidental knock on the head. And yes, caveman is doing some loose work in that opening question. These cases come from different communities and periods, not one tidy tribe living in matching caves. But the word gives us the practical picture quickly: no steel tray, no electric light, and no modern hospital standing by. The same goes for brain surgery. What survives most clearly is deliberate work on the skull's hard outer vault, not automatic proof of an operation on the brain beneath it. The human problem remains remarkable. A living person below, hard bone above, and almost no room for a careless move. Soon we'll lay out the broad options on a work table. A sharp edge can scrape. A point can drill a ring of small holes. A groove can be worked again and again until a piece loosens. Straight cuts can meet at corners. Different communities use different approaches, and in many cases the exact tool is gone. Stone is a serious possibility in selected cases, not a magic answer stamped onto every ancient skull. But before we follow any blade, we turn for a moment to the woman under the laboratory light. The smooth margin gives us the quietest possible form of suspense. Someone attempted the opening. She remained alive long enough for her body to answer. Then, at some point, there was another opening to explain. The light shifts across the table, catching one edge and then the other. We still don't know what was done about the pain. We don't know whether the tool was stone in this particular case. We don't know why the intervention was attempted or how long she lived afterward. Those questions are not failures in the story. They are the route through it. So we leave the laboratory with one useful fact and 3 open doors. A prehistoric woman survived at least one deliberate opening long enough for healing to begin. To understand how that could happen, our next stop is not a hospital and not a cave. It is a quiet work table where stone, bone, pressure, and patience can be considered one motion at a time. The next room is simpler. On a broad wooden table lie several objects that do not belong to one archaeological site. They are an editorial comparison, a sharp stone flake, a pointed tool, a bronze edge, and 4 plain drawings of openings in bone. Nothing here is a surgical kit. It is a way to see the mechanical problem without pretending that every community solves it alike. Begin with the stone flake. A freshly worked edge can be extremely sharp, which is why stone tools cut hides, plants, wood, and other materials long before steel existed. Sharpness, however, is only the first requirement. Cranial bone is curved, layered, and protecting tissue that cannot simply be treated like a plank on a bench. The useful question is not whether stone can cut. It can. The difficult question is how an operator could control the depth and shape of the opening. Archaeological literature describes several broad families of motion. The first is scraping. Imagine drawing an edge repeatedly across one bounded area, each pass removing a little material. The work is gradual. The surface changes before a large piece comes free. In a surviving skull, this can lead a sloping or beveled margin rather than a neat circular plug. The second family is drilling. The word may bring an electric tool to mind, so set that picture aside. Here it means repeated rotary work with a point, sometimes creating separate small holes that could be joined. A single opening might also be widened by turning or working a point in one place. The motion is different from scraping, and so is the pattern it can leave. Grooving is the third family. A line or ring is worked repeatedly until it separates an inner piece from the surrounding vault. The idea is familiar if you have ever scored cardboard before folding it, though the material and stakes could hardly be more different. What matters is the boundary. Instead of thinning one broad patch, the operator concentrates work along a planned path. Then there are linear cuts. Several straight cuts can meet to form an angular opening. The square opening reported at Megiddo belongs later in our journey, but it gives this family an unforgettable shape. A human operator did not need a modern circular saw to make straight boundaries. Repeated controlled cutting could create them, although the exact implement still has to be argued case by case. These families could also be combined. An opening might begin with one motion and be enlarged with another. A later stage of healing might blur the original marks. Damage after burial might remove part of the edge. The surviving shape is therefore more like the last page of a work log than a complete set of instructions. This is where popular retellings often get ahead of the evidence. If stone was available and stone can cut, it is tempting to label every old opening a stone tool operation. But some analyses point toward bronze or another metal, while many cases preserve no certain material signature at all. The motion may be more visible than the tool. An Italian Bronze Age review, for example, found several techniques represented among 19 reported people with 33 openings. Drilling was the most common technique when only one method was identified. That tells us something about the variety within one country and period. It does not create an instruction book for the whole prehistoric world. The important discovery is quieter. These were not random blows that happened to resemble surgery. In the cases that survive diagnosis, the edges record repeated, directed work. Different motions solved different versions of the same problem. Remove a controlled amount of cranial bone while limiting harm below it. On our comparison table, the stone flake no longer looks like a crude substitute for a steel scalpel. It looks like one possible edge among several, useful only when joined to judgment, patience, and a practiced motion. The clever part was never merely owning something sharp. The clever part was knowing when to stop. There is one more object to place on the table before we leave it, and it is not human. Picture the Atlantic coast of France more than 5,000 years ago. At the Neolithic settlement of Champteran, cattle were part of the working landscape. Much later, among the animal remains, researchers examined an almost complete cow cranium dated to roughly 3,400 to 30,000 BCE. On the right frontal bone was an opening that demanded an explanation. The marks did not look like an ordinary break. The researchers argued that the opening had been made with the same broad kind of bone-working technique seen on human crania. That finding produces a wonderfully awkward question. Was someone trying to treat a valuable animal, or was someone learning how an edge behaved on the skull before attempting the work on a person? The two possibilities lead in different directions. If the animal was alive and the opening was meant to help it, the case could represent extremely early veterinary surgery. A cow mattered. It supplied labor, food, hide, and status. A community might have had practical reasons to attempt a difficult treatment rather than simply surrender an injured animal. But the opening might also belong to practice. Bone offers resistance that skin, wood, and leather do not. An operator learning to scrape a shallow hollow would need to understand how quickly the surface changed, how the tool behaved when its angle shifted, and how much pressure turned control into a fracture. An animal skull could provide that lesson without placing a living person beneath the edge. Both stories are plausible. Neither is proved. We do not know the condition of the cow when the opening was made. We do not know whether the animal was alive, whether anyone hoped to save it, or whether a later practitioner ever carried a lesson from that skull to a human patient. The opening does not come with a label saying veterinary case or training exercise. It simply keeps both doors open. That uncertainty matters because skill has to come from somewhere. No prehistoric training manual survives. There is no list of apprentices, no sequence of lessons, and no record of the first nervous attempt. Yet repeated procedures with controlled margins show the knowledge could be retained. Someone could watch where another person placed a hand. Someone could learn which edge stayed useful, which motion removed bones slowly, and which warning signs meant it was time to stop. This need not resemble a formal school. Most difficult work in a small community can travel through demonstration, correction, memory, and repetition. A person who already knew how to shape stone, butcher an animal, set a fracture, or work horn and bone would not begin with empty hands. Those crafts would not automatically make a cranial operator, but they supplied habits of pressure, angle, patience, and material judgment. The cow from Champteran therefore gives us no neat origin story. It gives us something better, a glimpse of the learning problem. A sharp flake may have been made in minutes. The judgment behind it could have taken years. When we ask how a caveman surgeon opened a skull, the answer is not only with stone. It is with an edge whose behavior somebody had learned well enough to trust near a living head. That answer brings us directly to the question the work table cannot hold. Bone can preserve a scrape, a groove, or a cut. It cannot preserve the sensation of the person beneath the operator's hands. The objects remain on the table as the room darkens, and we turn toward the part of the operation that archaeology has almost completely lost. The evidence room is dim again. On one side of the table lies everything hard enough to survive for thousands of years: bone, stone, a trace of metal and soil. On the other side is an empty space where almost everything a patient experienced has disappeared. Pain belongs mostly to that empty side. There is no need to pretend the question is mysterious. Work on living cranial bone would create pain. The intriguing part is what the community could have done about it, and the honest answer is that the exact method is usually not preserved. Soft plant matter decays, liquids vanish, and words are not fossilized. A hand held during a frightening moment leaves no mark that can be measured under a microscope. Modern terms can make the gap look smaller than it is. If we say anesthetic, we may accidentally picture a known drug, a measured dose, and a predictable effect. If we say operating room, we import lighting, instruments, staff, and rules that the archaeological case has not supplied. The safer language is possible pain control in a treatment setting we do not know. That does not mean every possibility has equal weight, and it does not permit us to select a favorite herb from a list of ancient plants and quietly place it beside the patient. A plant may have been known in some later culture. A fermented drink may be imaginable. Neither fact by itself proves what happened beside a particular prehistoric skull. Plausibility is not a prescription label. The body itself creates another complication. Healing may tell us that the person lived beyond the opening. It does not tell us how awake they were, how much they moved, or whether the work happened in one sitting. It cannot explain how discomfort changed afterward. Even the length of survival is usually less precise than we would like. Bone is an excellent witness to some events and a famously poor gossip about everything else. One published double trepanation case at Pontecagnano was described by its investigators as having been achieved without anesthetic, antiseptic, or technological aids. That striking wording reflects the absence of modern systems, not the discovery of a complete prehistoric bedside record. The same case preserves prolonged healing, but not the missing substance, gesture, or method that may have helped the person endure the work. It is reasonable to ask whether the patient had to remain still. It is not reasonable to invent the ropes, assistance, or instructions that made stillness possible. A community may have organized the task in ways that left no durable trace. A script can acknowledge the practical need without turning it into a reconstructed scene presented as fact. Pain also touches motive. A procedure might be attempted because a person was already suffering from trauma or disease. In that situation, the pain of intervention existed beside the pain of the condition. At Pontecagnano, investigators later suggested that a double opening may have been intended to relieve pain associated with chronic bone infection. Their suggestion is important because it joins lesion and pathology in one named case. It still does not reveal the patient's experience or prove a universal purpose. Centuries after the prehistoric cases, a written voice finally enters the room. On the Greek island of Chios, archaeologists found a trepan's skull that researchers have compared with the medical tradition associated with Hippocrates. Beside it, in our imaginary evidence room, lies a copy of the treatise usually called On Head Wounds. The pairing is rare. Bone normally gives us an opening without instructions. A surviving medical text gives instructions without identifying the patient whose skull we hold. At Chios, the two kinds of evidence come close enough to compare, although they never quite lock together like matching halves of a broken tablet. The Hippocratic writer discussed when trepanation might be used after head injury. He described timing and technique, warned that details mattered, and noticed that skull thickness varied by location and age. Those observations show a written system attending to the same practical problem that earlier operators had faced. The cranial vault is not uniform, and a method safe enough in one place may be more dangerous in another. The text is later than the prehistoric communities at the center of our story. It cannot be carried backward as their missing handbook. We do not know whether the operator at Camino da Molino, Pontecagnano, or Prehistoric held the same ideas, used the same indications, or belonged to any connected line of teaching. Similar attention to thickness can arise from repeated experience without shared words. Nor does the Chios comparison solve the pain question. The presence of a medical treatise does not supply a reliable anesthetic to every earlier case. it does something subtler. It shows how much information can exist around a procedure and still fail to survive with most patients. A written tradition might discuss why, when, and where to open the skull, while leaving modern readers with questions about sensation, support, and recovery. The Kyle skull has been presented as evidence of trepanation performed in line with Hippocratic teaching, but only a limited number of skeletal finds can be connected plausibly to that medical setting. Even here, the excavated operator did not sign the bone or point to a particular sentence. The comparison rests on context, lesion, and historical fit rather than a name attached to the hand. This rare meeting of text and bone helps us appreciate the silence of the older record. If written words can survive and still leave gaps, a prehistoric skull alone cannot be expected to answer every intimate question. It can tell us where an opening lay. It may preserve the motion of a tool. It may reveal healing. It cannot replay the conversation that happened before the work began. Perhaps the person was told what would happen. Perhaps the task was understood through custom rather than explanation. Perhaps the operator was a familiar figure. Perhaps everyone present was frightened. Each sentence sounds human because each could happen. None becomes history until evidence chooses among them. So we return from chaos without borrowing its later medicine for our earlier patients. The written case confirms that careful cranial practice could include decisions about timing, position, and technique. The prehistoric bone confirms that such decisions were made long before the surviving text. Between them remains the same quiet blank where the experience of pain once lived. So the answer to our second opening question is not a secret recipe. Prehistoric communities may have had ways to calm, support, distract, intoxicate, restrain, or comfort a person. But a particular method must not be stated without particular evidence. In most trepanation cases, exact pain control is one of the things time carried away. This missing answer is frustrating only if history is expected to behave like a modern chart. If we let the gap remain visible, it does something more useful. It reminds us that a healed opening represents not just technical work, but an experience that was once immediate to a living person and is now beyond recovery. We cannot read the pain. We can, however, read a response. Along some margins, bone changed after the event. That change brings us back from the empty side of the table and toward the physical sign that allows archaeologists to say with care that a person survived. Our next scene begins with a row of drawings rather than a row of skulls. One shows a sharp-edged break. Another shows a rounded margin. A third shows an opening that formed as part of the skull's own development. The fourth shows damage that occurred long after death. The drawings are simple because the decision behind them is not. Before an opening can become evidence of surgery, it has to survive a rather unfriendly interview. Could it be a congenital feature? Could trauma have caused it? Could infection or a tumor have destroyed the bone? Could soil pressure, excavation, handling, or later breakage have produced the shape? If a plausible rival explanation fits better, the operation leaves our story. This process is called differential diagnosis, but the idea is ordinary. When water appears beneath the sink, a careful person checks the pipe, the seal, the drain, and the spilled bucket before announcing that the wall has failed. Archaeologists do something similar with openings in bone, except the plumbing has been gone for several thousand years. Congenital openings can be especially persuasive imposters. An older study drew attention to bilateral gaps in the parietal bones that had been displayed as examples of trepanation. Their symmetry and anatomy offered a different explanation. The openings were developmental, not the result of an operator's tool. Reclassification did not weaken the field. It removed bad examples and made the remaining cases more trustworthy. Trauma asks different questions. A blow can create missing bone, fractures, and later healing. An intentional opening may also occur near a fracture, perhaps as part of treatment. The location, edge, associated cracks, and biological response all matter. A simple circle drawn around the defect cannot decide the case. Disease can remove bone more slowly. Infection and malignancy may alter margins, create porous surfaces, or change nearby tissue. Again, the pattern and context matter more than the dramatic appearance. An opening is not upgraded to surgery simply because it looks impressive in a photograph. Then there is damage after death. Bone can break in burial, during excavation, in storage, or through older preparation methods. Such damage has no healing response because the body was no longer maintaining the tissue. Yet absence of healing does not automatically prove post-mortem damage either. A person may have died during or soon after an intervention, before visible remodeling developed. When healing does occur, the margin can become rounded, remodeled, or otherwise reorganized. That response supports survival beyond the event. It may also erase the very marks that would identify the original technique. The investigator gains one answer and loses part of another. Researchers have compared archaeological lesions with modern clinical examples to explore how healing stages relate to time. The comparison helps, but it does not turn the ancient edge into a calendar. Age, health, procedure, contamination, and individual biology all affect the response. Terms such as partial or complete healing are useful descriptions, not timestamps accurate to a particular Tuesday. This is why the phrase "survived the operation" needs care. Remodeling means the body was alive and responding after the opening. It does not by itself prove cure, comfort, independence, or a long life. A person may have survived the procedure and remained seriously ill. Another may have healed well. The bone rarely supplies the rest of the chart. Still, the conclusion is substantial. After rival causes are tested and healing is identified, a remodeled margin records a living response to intentional cranial work. The person beneath the opening was not an abstract patient in a textbook. Their body began to repair what had been done. The confidence to say that was not always available. In the 19th century, ancient openings were already entering European collections, but an opening in a skull did not explain itself. Scholars first had to learn which details could separate an operation performed on a living person from damage made by soil, excavation, disease, development, or a blow after death. Paul Broca became one of the best-known figures in that change. In 1867, he commented on a pre-Columbian Peruvian skull that came to be widely recognized as evidence of trepanation on a living person. He later turned his attention to older finds from France. The important move was not simply to point at a hole. It was to read the altered edge as a biological response. The bone had changed because the person was alive after the opening was made. That insight lasted. Broca's explanation for why prehistoric people performed the operation did not fare as well. In the 1870s, he proposed that trepanation began as a response to convulsions in children and that prehistoric people imagined an opening would release troubling spirits. It was an inventive 19th century story placed over silent bone. No prehistoric patient or operator had left testimony to confirm it. This is a useful warning for our own journey. A researcher can make one durable observation and one fragile interpretation in the same paper. Broca helped establish that healing could reveal survival. His account of convulsions and escaping spirits remains speculation from his own intellectual world. We keep the first contribution and set the second down gently. Another correction arrived through a much less dramatic object. Some skulls have naturally occurring openings in both parietal bones. They are developmental features, often known in the older literature through the Catlin mark. Because the openings can look remarkably tidy, specimens were once displayed as examples of trepanation. A 1945 paper drew attention to that confusion. Its author argued that many supposed operations were actually clear cases of bilateral congenital openings. The correction did not make the archaeological record less interesting. It made the surviving cases stronger by removing examples that did not belong. Imagine a museum drawer changing labels after decades. Nothing about the skull itself has changed. What changes is the question being asked of it. Symmetry begins to matter. Position matters. The surface inside the opening matters. The relationship to fracture lines, disease, and the skull's normal development matters. An old confident label gives way to a better diagnosis. Modern researchers can add magnification, radiography, and three-dimensional imaging to that comparison. They can ask whether compact bone bridges part of an exposed inner layer, whether an edge shows organized remodeling, whether a groove repeats a deliberate hand motion, and whether another condition could have produced the same shape. None of those tools is a time machine. Together, they reduce the room available for an attractive mistake. The history of trepanation research is therefore also a history of learning to say no. No, the symmetrical opening is probably developmental. No, this jagged loss may have happened after burial. No, this patch of destruction may reflect disease. Only after those answers have been tested does the word operation become useful. That careful refusal is why a healed case carries weight. It has survived not only the ancient intervention but a modern argument. The opening has been compared with its lookalikes. The edge has been read for living response, and the limits remain visible. Archaeology does not make the old procedure certain by sounding certain. It makes the case stronger by showing what else was considered. One opening can show that response. Two openings on the same skull create a longer and stranger sequence. We now return to the woman in Spain, then travel north toward another person whose skull also preserves more than one intervention. Return for a moment to the laboratory in Spain. The two openings in the adult woman's skull do more than double the visual surprise. They create a sequence. Whatever happened here was not necessarily one dramatic afternoon. The healed bone tells the researchers that she remained alive after the interventions, and their analysis argues that the two openings were produced at different times. The dating places her between about 2566 and 2239 BCE. Her remains came from a large Copper Age burial site in southeastern Spain, where 1,338 individuals were documented across 2 phases. That number matters because it turns one striking skull into part of a much larger human setting. She belonged to a community that buried many people there, not to a lonely cave invented for a movie. The investigators did not rely on one glance and a confident shrug. They combined ancient DNA, physical examination, and scanning electron microscopy. Each method answered a different kind of question. Genetic evidence contributed to identifying the person as female. The shape and surface of the openings helped with diagnosis. Microscopy brought the margins close enough to study details that an unaided eye could miss. The resulting picture is firm in some places and open in others. The woman had 2 cranial openings. The study treated them as trepanations and found evidence compatible with survival. It also argued that the interventions occurred at different times. We do not know the operator's name, the conversation that preceded either attempt, or whether the same person performed both. That last uncertainty is worth keeping. 2 operations on one patient do not automatically prove one famous village surgeon with a loyal customer. They could indicate the same practitioner, different practitioners, different motives, or a practice known by more than one person. The skull holds a sequence, not a staff roster. There is also a human implication that requires no invented dialogue. If the study's interpretation is right, someone decided to intervene again after an earlier opening had already been made. The second decision was informed by a visible past. The patient, the people around her, or both had encountered the procedure before. Now let the map drift north and east over valleys and rivers until it reaches Prehistoric in what is now Germany. Here another skull preserves 2 openings. The individual lived during the later 3rd millennium BCE, about 2700 to 2200 BCE, and the burial has been associated with the corded ware cultural horizon. One opening lay in the frontal region, close to the superior sagittal sinus, a major venous channel. The other was on the right parietal area. Even without turning the case into a modern operation, the frontal location makes the control problem easy to appreciate. Removing bone near important vessels leaves very little room for a wild hand. The published interpretation describes substantial healing and suggests that the individual survived for months or perhaps years. Those are broad estimates, not a stopwatch reading. Bone remodeling makes prolonged survival plausible, while the exact duration remains beyond the resolution of the evidence. Again, the unanswered questions gather around the bedside. Which opening came first? Was the motive the same on both occasions? Did one person learn from the earlier attempt? What did the patient feel? The case does not settle those details. It gives us something more restrained and, in its own way, more remarkable. Intentional openings were made twice, and the person lived long enough for the skull to respond. This is where the word successful needs a quiet correction. In a medical drama, success means that the patient's problem was fixed. In archaeology, success may mean only that a person survived long enough to produce recognizable healing. That is still an extraordinary result. It is simply not the same as proof of a cure. Repeated intervention changes our picture of prehistoric surgery. A single opening might be dismissed as an exceptional gamble. Two openings at different times suggest that at least some people considered the procedure worth attempting again. The reasons may be lost, but the repetition is visible. The paired cases also warn us not to manufacture one universal tradition. Spain and Germany are different places, separated by distance and local histories. Similar-looking decisions can arise without one shared handbook. What joins them is a practical fact. Communities were capable of planning, carrying out, and living beyond cranial operations more than once. We can now leave the cool northern ground and travel south to the Italian peninsula. There, one 5,000-year-old case brings the tool question closer. Its investigators proposed that the operator used not one motion, but two, and that part of the work may have been done with a stone point. The next object rests beneath the pale light of a digital scanner. It comes from Pontecagnano in southern Italy and is roughly 5,000 years old. At first, its openings might seem to offer exactly what our title promised: direct proof of brain surgery with a sharp stone tool. The real evidence is more interesting because it requires several careful steps. Researchers examined the lesions through their external form, X-rays, and three-dimensional computed tomography. These methods allowed them to compare the outer surface with structures inside the bone. They interpreted the principal opening as the result of scraping and a partial second opening as drilling with a stone point. Notice the wording. The stone point was not found neatly labeled beside the patient. It was inferred from the mark pattern. The interpretation is grounded in the lesion's shape and the author's technical analysis, but it remains an interpretation rather than a recovered surgical kit. In the imagined workshop of our earlier chapter, scraping and drilling sat on different parts of the table. Pontecagnano brings them onto one skull. The broader opening appears to have been worked by gradually scraping away bone. The incomplete lesion suggests a pointed tool rotating or boring into the surface. Two motions, perhaps used for different immediate purposes, were recognized in the same individual. There was also biological response. The researchers reported bone regrowth and attributed prolonged survival to the individual. The operation, in the limited archaeological sense, did not end at the moment the tool touched bone. The body continued the story. The skull also showed signs of chronic osteomyelitis, an infection involving bone. The investigators proposed that the trepanation may have been intended to ease pain related to that condition. This is one of those moments when an ancient motive comes tantalizingly close, then stops just beyond certainty. The pathology is real. The suggested connection is reasonable. The patient did not leave a note explaining why the opening was made. Even so, the proposal helps us think like the people facing the problem. Imagine not a theatrical caveman doctor eager to experiment, but a community watching someone endure persistent illness and pain. An intervention that appears extreme to us may have been considered beside an existing condition that was already dangerous or unbearable. The mechanical work would still have demanded control. Scraping has an important practical quality. It can remove bone little by little. The operator can inspect the surface as it thins. That does not make the procedure safe, painless, or simple. It does explain why a gradual motion could be useful when a few millimeters mattered. A stone point offers a different kind of control. Concentrated on a small area, it can start or deepen a hole. If several holes were made, the spaces between them could potentially be worked away. Yet we should resist turning that broad mechanical possibility into a claim about the exact order at Pontecagnano. The preserved marks support the proposed techniques more securely than they support a complete choreography. There is no preserved answer for what happened immediately afterward. We do not know what covered the wound, whether it was washed, which substances touched it, or who checked it the next day. Bone regrowth demonstrates life, but not a dressing recipe. That absence prevents an easy myth. The case does not prove that prehistoric surgery was secretly identical to modern neurosurgery. It shows something more grounded. People could use simple edges and points with enough control to alter the cranial vault, and at least this person lived long enough for new bone to form. The trail of the missing instrument now carries us far to the east. For a long time, some English-language histories treated ancient Chinese trepanation as nearly absent. The assumption fitted an old contrast. China was imagined as a place of traditional medicines and non-surgical treatment, while cranial operations belonged elsewhere. Archaeological and literary reviews complicated that picture. Multiple Chinese skulls have been reported with openings and signs interpreted as healing. One early corpus describes 6 clinically trepaned specimens from 5 sites, spanning roughly 5,000 to 2,000 years before the present. The cases cross several archaeological periods rather than belonging to one moment or one community. The authors discussed sharp stone or metal edges as possible tools for cutting and scraping. For an early specimen, they considered a stone flake possible. They also listed smoothed or rounded borders, healed spongy texture, and bone spurs among the features used to think about survival. Notice how carefully the material claim has to be carried. An early date does not automatically place a stone tool in the operator's hand. Stone remained available in periods when metal also existed, and a groove in bone does not always preserve a unique signature. The Chinese cases support the possibility of sharp stone in a bounded case. They do not prove that every early operation used it. Farther north and west, in the Gorny Altai, researchers examined 3 trepaned skulls from a collection of 153 associated with the Prehistoric culture, dated to about 500 to 300 BCE. Here, the investigation sounds almost startlingly modern. The team used visual examination, magnification, multi-slice computed tomography, high-field magnetic resonance imaging, elemental analysis, and synchrotron X-ray fluorescence. Each method asked a slightly different question. Magnification could reveal small repeated marks. Imaging could show the shape and depth of the opening without cutting the specimen. Chemical analysis could look for unusual material at the trepanation site. The study was trying to narrow technique, instrumentation, and purpose from traces that had survived for more than 2,000 years. Even this laboratory orchestra did not make the absent tool reappear. Chemical traces and lesion shape can reduce possibilities. They can support an attribution more strongly than a glance at the surface. But the instrument itself was not found locked into the final groove, and interpretations about work on structures beneath the skull remain interpretations. This is why the humble stone flake still holds our attention. It was capable of an exceptionally sharp edge. It could be resharpened or replaced. It fitted a world in which skilled stoneworking was ordinary knowledge. Yet capability is not identity. To move from stone could do this, to stone did this. Archaeologists need a case whose marks, context, and analysis point in the same direction. Pontecagnano remains our strongest stop on that route because the study tied one partial opening to drilling with a stone point and reported healing at both sites. The early Chinese report supplies a second, more cautious possibility. The Prehistoric investigation shows how much work may be required to discuss an instrument that has vanished. The result is not disappointing. It is a more interesting kind of detective story. The tool appears first as a mechanical possibility, then as a trace pattern, then as a laboratory hypothesis, and only sometimes as a case-specific attribution. The closer we move toward proof, the quieter the wording becomes. By now, 3 parts of our opening question have begun to separate. How could the skull be opened? Through controlled motions such as scraping, drilling, grooving, or cutting. How was pain managed? In most cases, the exact method remains unknown. Did people survive? Some unquestionably lived beyond the intervention, although the meaning and duration of survival vary by case. The 4th part is the one no comfortable story should hide. Not every edge healed. In the next room, the light falls across 2 brothers, an angular opening, and another case in which the operation seems to have ended without recovery. The city of Megiddo stood at a crossroads in the ancient Near East. In a domestic area associated with wealth and status, archaeologists found the remains of 2 young adult men buried together. Biological evidence identified them as brothers. Their lives belonged to the late Bronze Age, around 1550 to 1450 BCE. Both brothers showed signs of serious, long-lasting disease. One also had an angular opening in the frontal bone produced by intersecting cuts. Its squared shape is a useful reminder that trepanation did not have to look like the tidy round hole most people imagine. The burial context gives the case social texture without giving us a diagnosis written on papyrus. These were not anonymous bones scattered beyond the settlement. The brothers were associated with an elite household, and their remains suggest that illness had been present for some time. People around them had lived with that illness, responded to it, and ultimately buried them together. The cranial opening may have been an attempt to treat a problem, a ritual act, or an intervention shaped by ideas that no longer survive. The published case makes the operation visible but does not allow one simple motive to be declared. It also leaves the duration of survival after the cutting uncertain. This is where a good sleep story has to resist becoming too soothing. Ancient people were ingenious, but ingenuity did not cancel infection, bleeding, shock, or the underlying disease. A controlled opening could still fail. A practiced operator could still meet a problem beyond anyone's ability to solve. Another case, recovered from cremated Roman remains, makes that limit sharper. The skull was incomplete and heat-altered, yet investigators interpreted a cranial opening as surgical and associated the death with vascular injury. Because cremation and fragmentation complicate the evidence, the reconstruction deserves caution. Still, the author's conclusion was not a tale of recovery. It was a fatal outcome. The contrast with healed cases is essential. If we discuss only smooth, remodeled rims, prehistoric surgery begins to sound almost routine. It was not. Archaeological collections include people who survived, people whose outcomes remain ambiguous, and people who appear to have died during or soon after intervention. Failure also changes the meaning of skill. A procedure can be technically deliberate without being medically successful. Straight cuts can meet where the operator intended, yet the patient can die. The edge records controlled action. The body records a different result. The uncertainty is not a weakness to brush away. At Megiddo, the brothers' chronic disease and the elite setting invite large stories about special treatment, family concern, and access to expertise. Some of those ideas may be plausible. The safe conclusion is narrower. A young man with serious disease underwent an unusual angular cranial operation within a well-documented household and burial context. Act the Roman case, the temptation runs in the other direction. A fatal interpretation can become a lurid anecdote about a clumsy ancient surgeon. That would also outrun the evidence. The remains are incomplete, the circumstances are gone, and no fair judgment can be made about the practitioner from one damaged skull. What can be said is that the risk was real. Important vessels lay near the working surface. The protective layers beneath the skull could be harmed. An opening created a route for contamination. The reason the healed ancient case feels astonishing is that there were so many ways for the event to end badly. For the patient, success was not a clever mark on bone. It was the next breath, the next hour, and enough time for living tissue to alter the margin. For the people around them, it may have meant continuing to feed, shelter, and watch someone who was still injured or ill. Those ordinary acts rarely leave a neat archaeological signature. One Neolithic case from Grotta Patrisi in Italy makes that missing interval particularly strange. A modern reanalysis used stereomicroscopy to study marks too small for a casual glance. The first complete trepanation showed evidence consistent with survival. Patterned traces also allowed the researcher to discuss the direction and repetition of the operator's hand movements. Then the sequence changed. The same skull appeared to preserve another intervention around the time of death. The author raised the possibility that this later work occurred after death, perhaps in connection with funerary treatment. A more dramatic version of the hypothesis involves work on a severed head, but that remains precisely what it is, a hypothesis. The important fact is the two-stage sequence. One opening belonged to a period followed by living response. Another belonged close to death, where the biological clock becomes difficult to read. The skull can preserve both events without telling us whether the later one was treatment, ritual action, or something else. This brings us to a quiet trap in the phrase "no healing." It is tempting to hear those words as died immediately. Bone is not that punctual. A person may survive an injury or procedure for a short interval without leaving remodeling visible to an archaeologist. A modern study of cranial trauma helps explain the problem, though it cannot be transferred mechanically to prehistory. In that modern sample, the researchers generally did not observe the relevant bone-building or bone-removing response during the first week. By 6 weeks after fracture, both kinds of activity were scored in all specimens in the studied series. Another change, sequestration, appeared as a longer-term event beyond 8 weeks. Those intervals are not a conversion chart for ancient patients. Age, health, injury type, contamination, preservation, and the operation itself all differ. A modern trauma series can show why visible response may be delayed. It cannot tell us exactly how many days a particular Bronze Age person lived. At Vallebenis in Spain, 2 adolescent cases were reported without evidence of survival. That is the correct archaeological statement. It leaves open a small but important interval between the procedure and the first visible response. The individuals may have died during the event, soon afterward, or before remodeling became detectable. The evidence does not let us choose a precise hour. An unhealed opening must also be separated from work done after death. If a community removed bone as part of funerary treatment, no healing would be expected because there was no living interval to record. Tool marks can establish deliberate action, but deliberate action alone does not establish surgery on a living patient. So each opening asks for several clocks. Was the bone altered before death, around death, or after it? If before, did the person live long enough for early response? If healing is present, how extensive is it? The edge answers these questions unevenly. It may identify a broad sequence while refusing an exact duration. That refusal protects the survival numbers we will use later. A healed opening belongs in a survival category defined by the study. An unhealed opening belongs in a more complicated group, whose timing and meaning require case-by-case judgment. Counting becomes useful only after those categories are made visible. The unhealed edge, therefore, belongs beside the healed one. Together they prevent both caricatures. Prehistoric people were neither helpless fools, swinging rocks, nor miracle surgeons with a lost medical science. They were human beings making difficult interventions with the materials, experience, and beliefs available to them. Individual cases can show possibility, but they cannot answer our question about survival rates on their own. For that, we need groups large enough to count. Our next journey crosses the Atlantic and climbs into the highlands of Peru, where dozens of openings allow patterns to emerge. The Andes rise in long folds, with settlements, paths, and cultivated land arranged through difficult elevations. In the province of Andahuaylas, researchers study trepanation across 5 archaeological sites dating from roughly AD 1000 to 1250. This is later than the Copper Age cases in Europe, but it remains part of the long pre-modern history of cranial surgery performed without modern hospitals. The study included 32 individuals and 45 trepanations. Keep those two numbers separate. A person can have more than one opening, so counting holes is not the same as counting patients. That simple distinction will become very important when survival percentages appear. Several techniques occurred within the sample. The evidence did not reveal one Andean method replacing every other option. Different motions were used during the same broad period, a sign that practitioners could be working within varied local traditions or choosing methods for different circumstances. The dates also overlap a period after the collapse of the Wari state. That political change forms part of the regional context. It should not be turned into an automatic cause. The fact that surgery and upheaval occur in the same centuries does not prove that one produced the other. This restraint may sound fussy, but it protects the people in the sample from becoming props in a simple collapse story. Their openings could relate to trauma, illness, ritual, or other motives. Social instability may have affected life and injury. The bones do not provide one causal sentence for all 32 people. What the group does provide is variation. Some openings show evidence of healing. Others do not. Some people were treated once, while others had multiple interventions. Techniques could coexist, and outcomes could differ. We have moved from the bright circle around one famous skull to something more like a practiced landscape. Imagine the 5 sites as points on a night map. A line connects them only for our convenience. At each point were local families, local histories, and people whose names are gone. The 45 openings are not 45 copies of one event. Each began with a separate decision made around a separate body. The sample also makes a hidden problem visible: preservation. A skull that survived in recoverable condition can enter the table. A burial destroyed by water, construction, looting, or time cannot. People whose remains were never found are absent before counting even begins. Archaeological rates always emerge from what remained available to study. Diagnosis adds another filter. An opening judged to be trauma, disease, congenital anatomy, or post-mortem damage should not enter the trepanation count. A disputed example may move in or out as methods improve. The denominator is built by scholarly decisions as well as excavation. Then healing has to be graded. Clear remodeling strongly supports survival. No remodeling may indicate death near the time of intervention, but preservation or an incomplete rim can make assessment difficult. Partial healing occupies the inconvenient middle. A percentage compresses all those judgments into one clean-looking number. None of this makes counting useless. It makes counting meaningful. The Andahuaylas study shows the cranial intervention was not confined to one astonishing patient. Across 5 sites, enough cases survive for researchers to compare methods and outcomes within a defined place and period. The greatest lesson is not that every operation went well, It is that a community of practice can leave a pattern. Operators repeated recognizable methods. Some patients returned to life long enough for bone to heal. Knowledge, however it was taught, did not have to be written down to be transmitted. From Andahuaylas, our map shifts toward Cuzco. There the sample becomes larger, repeat operations become more visible, and one published survival figure offers the clearest answer yet to the question that opened our story. It is an impressive number, but it needs its label attached. Across 11 burial sites in the Cuzco region, researchers examined 66 individuals with a total of 109 trepanations. Again, there are more openings than people. Repeated procedures were not a statistical accident at the edge of the study. They were part of the pattern the investigators set out to understand. The most common approaches in this sample involve cutting and scraping. The exact proportions and labels belong to the study's coding system. The evidence shows that practitioners were not locked into one motion. Techniques also changed over time. The investigators reported an overall healing-derived survival estimate of about 83% for the operations they assessed. They also described improvement through time. Later cases in their sequence tended to show better survival than earlier ones. 83% is the sort of number that jumps out of a thumbnail and begins running around without supervision. So let us place it gently back in its archaeological home. It is not a worldwide Stone Age survival rate. It comes from a particular set of sites, dates, preservation conditions, diagnoses, and rules for reading healing. Even within that home, the number does not mean that 83% of patients returned to perfect health. It reflects survival inferred from bone response. Someone could survive the opening and continue to suffer from trauma, infection, disability, or the original condition. The study measures an important threshold, but not a complete recovery. The trend through time is perhaps more revealing than the headline figure. If later outcomes were better, one reasonable interpretation is that knowledge improved. Practitioners may have learned which locations were safer, which methods were more controllable, or which patients were more likely to endure the intervention. The archaeological record cannot show the lesson itself. There is no classroom, no written manual, and no preserved conversation between an older operator and the younger one. The learning curve is an inference from changing outcomes and techniques. It is persuasive precisely because it emerges from repeated cases rather than one heroic biography. Selection may have mattered as much as hand skill. Knowing when not to operate can improve outcomes. Choosing a location away from especially dangerous anatomy can improve outcomes. Stopping before the opening becomes too large can improve outcomes. A successful tradition may depend on quiet judgment that leaves fewer marks than the tool. Repeated trepanations add another clue. If an individual underwent more than one intervention and at least an earlier opening healed, the later procedure occurred in a world where survival was already known firsthand. The community did not need a modern journal article to learn that a person could live after cranial bone was removed. They could see the person walking among them. This does not prove that every later operation was based on calm evidence. Belief, ritual, social status, injury, desperation, and experience may all have met around the same patient. Human decisions rarely come from one tidy box, including our own. The regional sequence also warns against the phrase primitive medicine. Primitive compared with what? The practitioners had no germ theory, CT scanner, powered drill, or modern anesthetic machine. Yet some achieved repeatable survival with hand tools and knowledge accumulated in practice. Calling them primitive explains nothing about how that happened. A better question is what sort of observations could travel between attempts. People could notice bleeding, consciousness, swelling, wound appearance, and whether a patient lived. They could remember which motions were easier to control. They could copy a skilled hand. None of those learning pathways requires writing, although the archaeological record cannot tell us which ones were used. The Cuzco data therefore support a modest but important claim. In this sample, Survival inferred from healing was high, and outcomes improved over time. That looks less like a chain of random experiments and more like a practice capable of retaining useful knowledge. We are finally ready to answer the survival question with more than one number. To do it honestly, we will place the Cuzco percentage beside several very different samples and ask what each denominator can and cannot tell us. The question from the beginning returns to the table. How many people survived? The most accurate answer is not one global percentage. Survival varies by place, period, sample, preservation, procedure, and the way researchers classify healing. In the Cuzco study, the published estimate was about 83% across 66 people and 109 openings. That is strong evidence that survival was far from rare in that sample. It remains a regional result built from healing, not a census of every operation performed in the ancient Andes. An early medieval study from southern Germany offers a different kind of number. Researchers examined 384 skulls and identified trepanation in 8 people, about 2.1% of the collection. 7 of those 8 showed healing, while 1 case was interpreted as a death associated with infection. 7 out of 8 sounds even more impressive than 83%, but the sample of operated people is very small. One additional outcome would change the percentage sharply. The larger number, 384, answers how common recognized trepanation was in that skeletal collection. The smaller number, 8, is the relevant group for outcomes. Mixing the two denominators would produce nonsense with excellent posture. A broad Peruvian record contains far more material. Researchers have analyzed more than 800 trepanned crania spanning nearly 2,000 years, beginning around 400 BCE. This enormous corpus establishes Peru as one of the richest regions for studying the practice. It does not mean all 800 belong to one population, one century, or one surgical tradition. Across such a long span, techniques, political settings, warfare, diet, burial customs, and preservation can change. A single average would hide the very variation researchers want to understand. The size of the corpus gives us power only when its internal differences remain visible. Bronze Age Italy provides another reminder. Our review assembled 19 individuals with 33 trepanations. Drilling was the most common single technique where only one method was identified, and the cases were unevenly distributed across the peninsula. The count is valuable for technique and geography, but it is not automatically a clean survival survey. The patient versus opening problem follows us everywhere. Suppose one person has 3 healed openings. Counting operations yields 3 successful interventions. Counting patients yields 1 survivor. Both statements can be correct, but they answer different questions. A responsible percentage must announce which one it uses. The healing threshold creates a second problem. Clear new bone is strong evidence that life continued. Very slight reaction may represent a short interval, a difficult observation, or a contested classification. Complete remodeling may indicate prolonged survival while concealing the original marks. Researchers must translate continuous biological change into categories convenient enough to count. Then comes the missing population. A fatal operation could leave a skull, but only if burial and preservation allow recovery. A successful operation could disappear for the same reasons. Communities that practiced other burial customs may be underrepresented. Museum collections may have been assembled selectively. Excavated samples are not random national surveys. With all those cautions, a clear conclusion survives. Many prehistoric and pre-modern patients did survive cranial operations. We know because their bone began to heal, sometimes extensively, and because some individuals underwent repeated procedures. In certain defined samples, healing-derived survival was remarkably common. We also know that not everyone survived. Unhealed openings, infection, and vascular injury appear in the record. Some cases remain too damaged or ambiguous to classify confidently. Any honest answer must leave room for all 3 groups: survived, died near the event, and unknown. If someone insists on one number for the whole prehistoric world, archaeology cannot provide it. The word prehistoric covers immense stretches of time and communities separated by oceans, mountains, languages, and traditions. Averaging them together would be like calculating one medical success rate for every hospital on Earth, then mixing in several thousand years of missing paperwork. The useful answer is therefore layered. At Cuzco, about 83% of assessed operations were classified as survived through healing. In one small early medieval German group, 7 of 8 operated people showed healing. Across the broader record, numerous healed and repeated procedures demonstrate that survival could be routine enough for knowledge to persist, while failures prove the danger never disappeared. This answer is less catchy than a universal percentage, but much closer to the people themselves. Their outcomes belong to particular communities with particular experience. The question is no longer whether a caveman could possibly survive a hole in the skull. The evidence says many people did. The deeper question is what happened while they recover. The scene grows quieter now. The tool has been set down. The dangerous opening has ended. A living patient remains, and survival must continue beyond the operator's final motion. At Pontecagnano, on the central coast of Peru, one burial has drawn attention to a woman with trepanation in an Ixma cultural context. The case belongs to a wider discussion of surgery, social identity, and care. It offers a person to think with, but not a preserved nursing schedule. The woman was elderly by the standards used in the study. Her skeleton preserved bilateral cervical ribs, severe osteoarthritic destruction in the right shoulder, and a healed trepanation. These are 3 observations from one life, but they are not 3 pieces of one simple diagnosis. The additional ribs were congenital. The damaged shoulder belonged to a long process that would have affected movement and the use of the right arm. The cranial opening had healed. Researchers could place these facts beside one another, yet they could not assume that the trepanation caused the shoulder problem, cured it, or was performed because of it. The case for care begins with function. A shoulder joint altered so severely can change how a person lifts, carries, reaches, dresses, prepares food, and steadies the body during movement. The study considered how our conditions compromise mobility and independence in basic tasks. From there, it asked what direct support or accommodation would have been required over time. Accommodation can be quieter than constant nursing. A task can be arranged differently. A heavy object can be placed within easier reach. Work can be shared. A route through a settlement can be chosen with another person's movement in mind. These are examples of what accommodation means, not a recovered list of what happened at Pontecagnano. Direct support is more personal but no easier to name. It might involve help with food, movement, hygiene, or other ordinary needs. The evidence supports the conclusion that assistance was required. It does not preserve the helper's age, relationship, feelings, or daily schedule. The woman was identified with an Ixma Elu, a social group often translated imperfectly through ideas of kinship and community. The study used the wider social context to consider whether caregiving may have been relatively common. That does not mean every person received identical help. It means her long life with limiting conditions was not treated as an isolated biological accident. Now place the healed opening back into that longer life. It tells us that she also survived a cranial intervention long enough for bone to remodel. It does not tell us whether the operation came before or after the worst shoulder damage, whether the same people assisted through both, or whether the trepanation changed her dependence. This separation is the strength of the case. If we used the healed whole alone, we could invent a devoted bedside vigil and call it care. By examining the conditions that affected basic function, researchers can argue for support on firmer ground. The trepanation then becomes one event within the life of a person who already gives us independent evidence of long-term dependence. Her age matters in the same restrained way. Reaching old age with a congenital condition and severe joint destruction means her life extended through many ordinary demands. Meals still had to be obtained. Seasons still changed. Tasks still appeared each morning. We cannot turn those facts into a sentimental biography, but we can recognize that survival was social as well as biological. The same reasoning changes our image of the operator. A skilled hand may have opened the skull, but one hand does not make a recovery. A community able to accommodate limited movement already possessed habits of adjustment and support. Whether those exact habits surrounded the trepanation is unknown, yet the case proves that organized care belongs within the social world we are considering. Pontecagnano therefore gives us neither a prehistoric hospital nor a lonely miracle patient. It gives us an elderly woman whose body records long-term impairment, a healed cranial opening, and survival within a named social context. The paper's argument for caregiving rests on dependence and accommodation, while the trepanation remains a separate, remarkable event. This distinction matters. A healed opening may imply that someone lived for a meaningful interval. It does not identify who brought water, prepared food, cleaned the wound, changed bedding, or watched for danger. It does not even prove that all of those acts occurred in the forms we imagine. Bioarchaeologists approach ancient care through a broader method, sometimes called the index of care. The process moves through 4 stages. First, researchers describe and diagnose the condition. Second, they consider how it would have affected ordinary function and whether help was likely needed. Third, they model the kinds of care that could meet those needs. Fourth, they interpret what that care might mean in its social setting. The order is important. It begins with the body, not with a sentimental scene. Only after the impairment is assessed do researchers ask what assistance would have been necessary. Even then, they distinguish likely care from a named caregiver or exact routine that the evidence cannot supply. Imagine a person with reduced mobility, impaired vision, chronic pain, or a fresh wound. The archaeological question is not merely whether the condition existed. It is whether the person could have obtained food, moved through their surroundings, maintained hygiene, and remained alive without assistance. Long survival with severe impairment can support an inference that help was provided. Trepanation complicates this reasoning because the operation and the original illness may both affect function. A patient could need care because of head trauma, infection, neurological symptoms, or the wound itself. The skull seldom separates these needs into tidy categories. What it can sometimes show is duration. Extensive remodeling suggests that life continued beyond the immediate crisis. Repeated procedures show that a person returned to a treatment setting, however that setting was organized. Those facts make social support plausible, but they do not preserve the hands that offered it. This is also the closest we can come to the pain question without inventing a potion. Comfort may have involved substances, touch, restraint, ritual, familiar voices, or simply endurance. Exact drugs and methods are usually unknown. The absence of proof is not proof that people did nothing. It is a boundary around what we can responsibly name. The care question makes prehistoric communities feel less distant because it is built from ordinary needs. Someone who is weak must still drink. Someone with an open wound must pass through the next night. Someone frightened by an operation may respond to a trusted presence. These are human possibilities, not archaeological observations, so we hold them softly rather than presenting them as facts. Wider evidence of survival with disability shows that ancient people sometimes supported individuals whose conditions would have made daily life difficult. Each case must be evaluated on its own terms, but the broader lesson is important. Dependence and care are not modern inventions. For a trepanned patient, technical success may therefore have depended on more than the operator. A steady hand could make the opening, yet recovery might involve food, protection, cleanliness, rest, and time. The social system around the patient may have mattered as much as the tool, even when it leaves no visible cut mark. There is a temptation to call this compassion and move on. Compassion may indeed have been present, but care can arise from duty, kinship, status, reciprocity, belief, or practical necessity. Archaeology cannot read the emotion directly. It can sometimes show that survival would have been difficult without help. The unknown caregiver is one of the quietest figures in our story. No skull opening bears their signature. No healed rim records the water they carried. Yet the longer a seriously affected person lived, the harder it becomes to imagine the operation is the work of one isolated technician. Our original title placed the sharpstone tool at the center because it is visually irresistible. By the end of recovery, the tool is only one member of a larger cast. Knowledge selected the location. A practiced motion controlled the edge. The patient's body repaired the bone. Other people may have helped make that repair possible. The lamp is burning lower now. Before we close the laboratory, there is one final trap to avoid. We cannot gather every ancient opening into a single tale about the first surgeons. The evidence stretches across too many lands and too many millennia for that. On the last map, the sites do not form a route of discovery. They are points separated by coastlines, deserts, mountain chains, and long intervals of time. Southern Spain, central Germany, Italy, the Levant, Anatolia, and the Andes all contributed cases to our journey. Similar openings do not make them one culture. Anatolia offers the clearest warning against squeezing a long record into one tradition. A regional review identified 40 individuals with trepanation from 23 settlements. Read quickly, that sounds like one substantial body of evidence. Read the dates, and the picture changes. The corpus stretches across about 10,000 years, from the Aceramic Neolithic to the late Ottoman period. 10,000 years is not a practice continuing unchanged. Settlements rose and disappear. Languages, beliefs, tools, political systems, and medical traditions changed. The people at the earliest site did not belong to the same world as those of the latest. The review found drilling and cutting among the principal techniques and reported drilling in early cases and much later ones, but a recurring motion is not proof of one continuous school. Sometimes the most economical solution to a material problem is discovered more than once. A rotating point makes a round depression. A repeated scraping motion slowly thins bone. A line of grooves can outline a piece for removal. Communities separated by centuries can arrive at similar motions because the skull presents similar resistance, not because one teacher's lesson traveled unbroken across the ages. The North Pontic region gives us a different scale. Research has examined 389 skulls from early and Middle Bronze Age burials and identified 25 cases of surgical intervention. Many were concentrated in the Dnipro steppe area. The authors argued that cranial surgery was a well-developed practice there and proposed another regional center on the map of Europe. That concentration is meaningful, but even a cluster needs caveats. It can reflect actual practice. It can also be shaped by which cemeteries were excavated, which skulls survived, which collections were available, and how cases were defined. A blank area on the map may mean no operations were found. It may also mean the evidence has not survived or has not been studied in the same way. In southern Russia, another pattern draws the eye inward. A group of Neolithic and Bronze Age cases placed openings along the midline, including a particularly dangerous location near an important venous channel. The repeated position and the absence of visible trauma or disease made a simple therapeutic explanation less obvious. Researchers discussed a possible ritual procedure. Possible is doing essential work there. The shared position may reflect a learned rule with social or ritual meaning. It may reflect a purpose not visible in bone. What it cannot do is recover the belief itself. No one wrote down why that point was selected. The pattern narrows the mystery without solving it. The Chinese record supplies one more lesson about maps. Older English-language summaries sometimes made the practice appear rare or absent in China. Wider archaeological and literary review brought multiple cases, including healed openings, back into view. The old blank space was partly a history of scholarship and access, rather than a faithful picture of ancient behavior. This makes the world map less like a route and more like a palimpsest. Some points represent single people. Some represent regional samples. Some are strong diagnoses made with modern imaging. Others are older reports awaiting new examination. The dates range so widely that the word prehistoric fits some and not others. They belong together only through a carefully bounded comparison. Across that comparison, several recurring truths remain. Human communities knew that bone could be altered. Some developed controlled ways of doing it. Some patients survived long enough for their skulls to remodel. Repeated operations showed that the experience was sometimes considered worth attempting again. Failure remained close at hand. What does not remain is a single origin, a single motive, or a single toolkit. Stone was plausible and, in specific studies, inferred. Metal appears in other cases. Therapeutic associations fit some openings, while ritual or funerary interpretations are discussed for others. The same rounded edge can tell us about survival without telling us what the operator hoped to accomplish. The scattered map is therefore not evidence of one forgotten medical empire. It is evidence that separate communities could observe a difficult human problem and devise local responses. Similar bodies created similar risks. Similar materials invited similar motions. Knowledge grew within particular places, and the bone preserved only a portion of what those places knew. The safest conclusion is also the most interesting. Cranial surgery was independently possible in many human settings because the problem could be approached with observable materials and learnable motions. Bone can be scraped, drilled, grooved, or cut. A sharp stone edge can perform some of that work. Metal may have been used in other cases. The exact tool must be established one patient at a time. How did prehistoric surgeons open a caveman patient's skull? Not by smashing through it and not by following one universal method. In the best supported cases, operators removed controlled amounts of cranial bone through repeated directed motions. Gradual scraping, point drilling, worked grooves, and intersecting cuts could all produce an opening while giving the hand some control over shape and depth. How did they manage pain before anesthesia? For most individual patients, we do not know. Possible substances and social methods are easy to imagine and difficult to prove. The honest answer is that the exact pain control, if any, usually vanished with the soft materials and spoken knowledge that once surrounded the event. How many survived? There is no responsible worldwide percentage. Survival was common enough to leave many healed openings and repeated operations. Some defined samples report high healing-derived survival, including about 83% in the Cuzco study. Other patients died, and many outcomes remain uncertain. The word successfully, therefore, carries several meanings. Technical success means making a deliberate opening. Immediate survival means living beyond the dangerous event. Biological survival means remaining alive long enough for bone to respond. Clinical success would mean improving the patient's condition, and that is usually the hardest result to prove. The skull is generous with the first three questions and guarded about the fourth. It can show intentional geometry, microscopic marks, and remodeling. It rarely tells us whether a headache eased, a seizure stopped, a ritual obligation was fulfilled, or an infection returned. This limit does not make the story smaller. It removes the fantasy of lost supermedicine and leaves more impressive human achievement. Without electric light, imaging, germ theory, manufactured steel, or modern anesthesia, some communities develop procedures controlled enough for many patients to survive. They may have learned through watching and repetition. They may have selected operators with unusual steadiness. They may have learned safer locations and better stopping points. These are reasonable ways knowledge can improve, but the exact teaching system is not preserved. The learning curve is visible more clearly than the lesson plan. The patient remains at the center, not a prop for a gruesome tale, and not a faceless percentage, but a person who entered a frightening moment with some mixture of illness, injury, belief, and hope. Around that person stood others whose roles are mostly gone. Perhaps the operator held a stone edge. Perhaps another tool was used. Perhaps someone steadied the patient or spoke in a familiar voice. The first two possibilities must be judged from marks and context. The last remains an image, not a claim. History becomes more trustworthy when we can feel the difference. Back in the laboratory, the skull rests beneath the lamp exactly as it did at the beginning. The openings have not changed, but our questions have. They no longer ask how supposedly primitive people performed an impossible trick. They ask how practical knowledge, patient endurance, biological healing, and community support met in a procedure of extraordinary risk. The microscope is switched off. The comparison tools are returned to their drawers. On the final page of the atlas, the sites fade one by one until only their small points of light remain. What survives is not a complete surgical manual. It is a collection of edges, some sharp, some rounded, some healed, and some forever uncertain. Read carefully. Those edges tell us that prehistoric people could do far more than endure the world around them. They observed it, worked upon it, learned from it, and sometimes carried one another safely through an opening in the bone. The drawer closes without a sound. The lamp settles into darkness, and the long record of those careful hands is allowed to rest.